Arrived at the farm just to take care of the animals, but ended up awakening feelings neither of them was prepared to face. The new veterinarian captivated the farmer with her competence, her quiet nature, and her attentive gaze. But behind that calm posture, she hid a dark past, a past that refuses to be left behind. When signs of that past begin to surface, threatening the peace of the farm and her own safety, the farmer realizes he's not dealing with just a mysterious woman, but with someone who has spent her entire life running from fear. How far would he go to protect someone who chose to stay, and how far could she go without running away once again? Before continuing, like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now get ready, because this story will prove that some new beginnings require courage, and others, truth. The sun had not yet fully broken the horizon when the old pickup truck moved slowly along the dirt road that cut through Valley Gold Farm. Dust rose lazily behind the vehicle, spreading through the cold morning air as the fields awakened in soft shades of gold and deep green. Antonio drove calmly, one steady hand on the wheel, the leather hat settled firmly on his head. His face bore the marks of time and life, subtle lines of a man who had learned early on that silence and patience are worth more than words thrown to the wind. The farm woke up with him. The distant lowing of cattle echoed across the pastures, mixed with the rhythmic sound of hooves striking the still damp ground of dawn. The wind moved through the old trees, carrying with it the strong scent of wet earth and the faint perfume of freshly cut grass. Antonio took a deep breath, letting the aroma fill his lungs. He had always believed that no fortune, no matter how great, was worth anything if he couldn't feel that living ground beneath his boots. It was there, in that quiet hour, that he remembered who he truly was. When he parked near the main corral, something caught his attention. A car he didn't recognize. A dark sedan, far too clean for that rustic environment, carefully parked near the veterinary shed. Antonio frowned slightly. He didn't like surprises. The farm was large, but everything there had a purpose, an owner, a known history. He stepped out of the truck with unhurried strides and walked toward the shed. That was when he heard a female voice, low, calm, almost a whisper. She wasn't speaking to someone, she was speaking to an animal. As he rounded the side of the shed, he saw her. The woman was crouched beside a newborn calf, still fragile, its coat stained with dirt and bits of straw. She wore gloves and touched the animal with absolute care, as if every movement were calculated to avoid causing pain. She spoke to it gently, as though the calf could understand every word, as if that simple act were enough to soothe it. Her light brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, though a few strands escaped, stirred by the morning breeze. She wore jeans, rubber boots, and a light-colored shirt with rolled-up sleeves. Nothing flashy, nothing staged. And yet there was something about her that stood out effortlessly. Antonio watched for a few seconds. It wasn't just beauty, though she was beautiful. It was her posture, her focus, the respectful way she handled the animal, as if that small gesture revealed much about who she was. He had known enough people to tell when someone was there just for the paycheck, and when someone carried something more, something quiet and deep. "Good morning," he finally said, breaking the silence. She lifted her head. Her eyes met his, and for a moment time seemed to slow. It wasn't an obvious impact, nor an exaggerated romantic spark. It was something subtle, almost instinctive, as if both had felt something difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. "Good morning," she replied, standing up with a polite but restrained smile. "You must be the new veterinarian," Antonio said, observing every detail with calm attention. "Yes, I am." "Laura?" she answered, extending her hand. The handshake was firm, steady, professional, no hesitation, no excess. Antonio noticed immediately. "Antonio," he said, "welcome to Golden Valley Farm." "Thank you. I arrived early." "I hope I didn't cause any trouble," she said, a slight note of caution in her voice. "Those who arrive early around here tend to last," he replied, neither smiling nor sounding harsh. She gave a faint smile, but something about it seemed contained, as if she were always ready to step back. Antonio noticed. He said nothing. Throughout the morning, they walked together through the corral and nearby areas. Laura explained the animals' conditions with technical precision, pointing out details few would notice. She spoke clearly, without arrogance. Antonio listened in silence. He knew charlatans, he knew mediocre professionals, and he knew true competence. Laura belonged to the last category. "Have you worked on large farms before?" he asked at one point. For a fraction of a second, something changed in her eyes, a reflex too quick to be staged. "I've worked in several places," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "Some bigger, some smaller." The answer was a little too correct, too controlled. Antonio noticed the evasion, but didn't push. He had learned early that too many questions close doors that silence can sometimes open naturally. As the days passed, Laura became part of the farm's routine. She arrived early, left late, treated the animals with dedication and the workers with respect. There was no arrogance, no pretense. Still, something about her remained distant, as if she were always ready to leave at any moment. She never spoke of family, never mentioned her past. She always stepped away when her phone rang. Antonio noticed everything, not out of suspicion but intuition. He knew people who carried invisible wounds, and Laura carried more than she let show. One afternoon, as they walked toward a more distant pasture, Antonio broke the silence. "Do you plan to stay here long?" he asked. Laura stopped. She looked out at the field ahead, the wind moving the tall grass. She took a deep breath, as if weighing each word before releasing it. "Long enough," she replied. "Long enough for what?" he asked calmly. She turned to him, her expression serious, no smile. "To start over." The word hung in the air, heavy, loaded with unspoken meanings. That night, Antonio sat alone on the porch of the main house, watching the star-filled sky. He thought of her apparent calm, of her constant distance, of the strange feeling that this woman carried a burden far too heavy for someone so young. On the other side of the farm, Laura was in her simple room. She let her hair down, stared at her reflection in the mirror, and whispered to herself almost like a warning, "Don't get involved." She had done that before, and the last time, she had barely survived. Laura's presence began to feel familiar at Golden Valley Farm, but never predictable. She followed the routine with precision, arriving before the sun had fully risen and leaving only when the day was already beginning to fade. Even so, there was something about her that remained on the margins, as if she were always ready to disappear the moment someone got too close. Antonio watched in silence. It wasn't idle curiosity. It was the instinct of someone who had learned over the years to recognize when a person carries more than they show. He noticed it in small gestures. The way Laura avoided personal questions, how her body reacted to unexpected sounds, the almost excessive care she took in locking doors and windows before leaving. One morning, while she was examining an older horse in the stable, Antonio noticed a slight tremor in her hands when a worker dropped a tool on the ground, producing a sharp noise. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but he saw it. "Are you okay?" he asked casually. Laura took a deep breath before answering. "I'm fine," she said, regaining control. "I was just startled." She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. That small reaction confirmed what Antonio had already suspected. Laura wasn't just reserved. She was constantly on alert, like someone who had lived too long expecting the worst. That same afternoon, an unfamiliar car drove slowly along the road that bordered the farm. It didn't enter. It only slowed down, as if observing. Antonio noticed immediately. He memorized the model, the color, the time. Years dealing with difficult people and complex business had taught him never to ignore details that didn't fit the pattern. Laura, meanwhile, saw the car and felt her stomach twist. The past had a cruel way of announcing its presence without asking permission. She spent the rest of the day unsettled, making small mistakes she normally wouldn't. Antonio noticed, but once again didn't press her. He knew some truths only surface when they find a safe space. That night, Laura tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound seemed louder than it really was. Every shadow cast by the dim bedside lamp seemed to carry intentions that didn't exist. She got up, walked to the window, and stared out into the darkness of the fields. The farm seemed too peaceful, and paradoxically, that made her more nervous. She sat on the bed and held her phone in her hands. The screen stayed dark. She didn't want to call anyone. She didn't want to be found. The next day, Antonio decided to act with caution. He didn't ask directly. Instead, he created space. "I'll need to go into town tomorrow," he said during the simple breakfast they occasionally shared. "If you want to come along, it might be useful to meet the medication supplier." Laura hesitated for a moment. "I can go," she replied, trying to sound normal. The drive was quiet. The pickup moved along the road while the radio played softly, almost forgotten. Laura watched the scenery pass by, but her mind was far away. Antonio respected the silence. In town, while he handled a few quick matters, Laura waited in the truck. That was when she felt it. That old heavy sensation, like an internal warning. She looked up and saw a man across the street. She didn't need confirmation. She would recognize that posture anywhere, the overly confident stance, the gaze that evaluated, not admired. The past had found the present. The man didn't approach. He only smiled, as if he knew he had been seen. Then he got into a car and drove away. Laura froze for a few seconds, her heart pounding far too hard. When Antonio returned, he immediately sensed that something had changed. "Did something happen?" he asked, starting the engine. Laura took a moment to answer. "No," she said finally. "I'm just tired." But Antonio knew. That wasn't exhaustion. Back at the farm, Laura tried to keep up the routine, but control was beginning to slip. That night, she sat alone on the smaller porch of the house reserved for workers and let the tears fall in silence. They weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of exhaustion. She had changed cities, changed names in some places, changed routines, changed her life. But some people refused to be left behind. Antonio appeared without making a sound. He didn't speak right away. He simply approached and stayed there, respecting her space. "He found me," Laura said without looking at him. Antonio sat beside her. "Who?" he asked, his voice firm. Laura took a deep breath. The silence that followed was heavy but necessary. "A man from my past," she replied. "Someone I thought I had left behind." "Did he hurt you?" Antonio asked without hesitation. Laura paused. Then she nodded slowly. "In ways that don't leave visible marks," she said, "but they leave fear." Antonio pressed his lips together slightly. That was enough. "Is he here?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied, "but he'll try to get closer. He always does." The wind passed through the porch, carrying the scent of the fields. Antonio looked into the darkness ahead, weighing possibilities. "While you're here," he said, "no one is going to touch you." Laura finally looked at him. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know enough," he replied. "People who like control can't stand losing it." She swallowed hard. I don't want to bring trouble into your life." "Trouble isn't the one who runs," Antonio said. "Trouble is the one who chases." Laura felt something different in that moment. It wasn't complete relief. It was something rarer. Safety, without conditions. "I should leave," she said anyway. "Only if it's because you want to," he replied. "Not because someone pushed you." She fell silent. That night, Laura slept little, but better than she expected. Not because the fear was gone, but because for the first time in a long while, she wasn't facing it alone. And Antonio, once again seated on the main porch, knew the farm's quiet was about to be tested, because when the past finds someone who has decided to stay, it never comes in peace. Laura woke before dawn, as if her body had learned not to fully trust rest. The sky was still dark, but a deep blue tone already stretched across the horizon, announcing that daylight would soon arrive. She lay there for a few minutes, staring at the simple ceiling of the room, listening to the quiet sounds of the farm waking up. Every noise was familiar now. Every sound had meaning. That comforted her more than any lock ever could. She dressed slowly, choosing practical clothes as always. When she stepped outside, she found Antonio already awake, leaning against the fence, silently watching the pasture. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Enough," she replied, using the same word she had used days earlier. He nodded, as if he understood exactly what that meant. That day's work was more intense. Antonio kept Laura busy, not as a distraction, but as an anchor. She examined animals, organized medications, spoke with workers. Each task demanded focus. Each occupied minute pushed intrusive thoughts a little farther away. But fear doesn't disappear just because routine continues. Early in the afternoon, one of the workers casually mentioned that he had seen a man asking about the farm at a gas station near the main road. He didn't describe threats. He didn't describe anything unusual. Still, Laura felt her body react before her mind did. Antonio noticed immediately. "Would you recognize this man if you saw him?" he asked later when they were alone. "I'd recognize him from far away," she answered, "even if he had his back turned." Antonio took a deep breath. "Then, if he shows up, you won't be alone." "I don't want to live under escort," Laura said, her firmness restrained. "It's not an escort," he replied. "It's presence." She thought about that. Presence didn't mean prison. It didn't mean surveillance. It meant not being isolated. That was new to her. That night, Laura decided to share more. Not everything, but enough. They sat on the smaller porch, away from the main house. The air was colder, the sky filled with stars. Laura held a warm mug with both hands, as if that heat were necessary to keep her voice steady. "I met this man when I was just starting my career," she began. "He had influence, connections, a respectable appearance. Everyone trusted him." Antonio listened without interrupting. "At first he seemed like support," she continued. "Then he became control. Everything had to go through him. My decisions, my schedule, my contracts. When I tried to leave, he didn't accept it." She paused, taking a deep breath. "People like him don't handle loss well," Antonio said calmly. "No," she confirmed. "They turn loss into pursuit." Laura explained how she had changed cities, cut ties, started over many times. Every time she thought she had found peace, something appeared, a subtle message, a familiar look, a forced reminder that running away wasn't the same as being free. "I thought it would be different here," she said. "Maybe because—" She hesitated. "Because you don't try to control me." Antonio looked at her. "I don't control people," he said. "I choose who stays." The sentence hung between them. "And if he comes here?" Laura asked. "If he tries to hurt you because of me?" "Then he chose the wrong place," Antonio replied, without raising his voice. Laura felt a chill run through her. It wasn't a threat. It was certainty. The days that followed confirmed the danger wasn't just paranoia. An unfamiliar car passed by the road again, then another, always at a distance, always watching, never advancing. It was psychological warfare. Laura began to notice something new. Antonio didn't react impulsively. He didn't confront. He didn't expose himself. He simply positioned himself, and that was more intimidating than any burst of anger. One afternoon she found him on the phone, his expression serious, his voice low. When he hung up, she asked, "Are you handling something because of me?" "I'm handling something for us," he replied. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Antonio said. "That's why I'm doing it the right way." Laura felt the weight of that silent protection. It wasn't heroism. It was responsibility. That night, the past came closer. Laura was organizing medications in the small improvised clinic when she heard footsteps outside. They stopped. The silence grew heavy. She froze for a second, her heart racing. Then she heard the voice. "Laura." It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, it was controlled, far too familiar. She didn't answer. "I know you're there," the voice continued. "You don't have to hide. I just want to talk." Antonio appeared immediately beside her, as if he had sensed the danger before hearing the sound. "Stay here," he said firmly. He stepped outside. Laura remained frozen, muscles tense, listening from a distance. She didn't hear shouting. She didn't hear arguments, only low, controlled voices, a brief conversation. When Antonio returned, his face was serious, but calm. "He left," he said, "for now." "What does he want?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "What he's always wanted," Antonio replied, "to regain the control he lost." Laura felt her legs weaken and sat down. "I can't keep bringing this into your life." Antonio knelt in front of her, lowering himself to her level. "You're not bringing anything," he said. "He brought it, and now he's dealing with me too." She looked at him, eyes filled with tears. "You have no idea what you're facing." "I have enough of an idea," he replied, "and I won't back down." That night Laura didn't sleep, but not only because of fear. Something inside her was beginning to change. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about running. She was thinking about standing her ground, and that was as frightening as it was liberating. As the man walked away down the dark road, smiling to himself, still believing he had some advantage, Antonio watched from the porch in absolute silence. He knew it wasn't over. But he also knew the game had changed, because now Laura was no longer alone, and he was not someone who usually lost. The following day began heavy, as if the air itself were thicker at Golden Valley Farm. There was no unusual noise, no strange movement, yet Laura could feel in her body that something was out of place. It was as if the past had left an invisible mark on the space, a silent presence that didn't fade with the rising sun. She tried to keep her routine. She walked to the stable, reviewed notes, examined a sick animal. But her concentration came in short waves. The memory of his voice, so close, so confident, echoed in her mind like a constant warning. Antonio noticed her effort to appear normal, and it made him even more alert. "You won't be alone today," he said as they walked toward the barn. "I don't want to become someone who lives surrounded," Laura replied firmly. "You won't," Antonio said, "but you also won't pretend nothing is happening." She knew he was right. Pretending had been her strategy for years, and it had never worked for long. That afternoon, Antonio received a call that confirmed what he already suspected. The man from Laura's past wasn't there on impulse. He had asked questions, gathered information, tested paths. He didn't want direct confrontation. He wanted pressure. He wanted to create the feeling that Laura would never truly be safe. Antonio ended the call and remained silent for a few seconds. Then he made a decision. "We're going to the city," he said to Laura. "Now?" she asked, surprised. "Now," he confirmed, "before he decides to set the pace." The drive was tense. Laura watched the road with heightened attention, as if expecting the past to appear at every curve. Antonio drove with his usual calm, but his mind was moving fast, weighing scenarios, possibilities, consequences. In the city, Antonio did something Laura didn't expect. He went into places she would never enter alone. He spoke with people she didn't even know he knew. He didn't use a threatening tone, nor did he ask for explicit favors. He simply made it clear that he was paying attention, that he knew who the man was, that he knew the history, that he would not allow dirty games in his region. Laura watched from a distance, sitting on a discreet bench, feeling something strange grow inside her. It wasn't dependence, it was recognition. Antonio wasn't trying to save her. He was setting boundaries where none had ever existed. When they returned to the farm, the sky was already beginning to darken. Laura stayed silent for most of the drive. She only spoke when the property appeared again ahead of them. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I did," Antonio replied, "because now he knows you're not alone anymore." She took a deep breath. "And if this makes things worse?" "Then we face it," he answered, "but we don't retreat." That night, Laura sat alone in her room for a long time, thinking, not about running, not about packing her bags. She thought about everything she had lived since arriving there. She thought about the constant fear she had carried for years. She thought about how much it had shaped her choices, her relationships, her very identity. She realized something painful. For a long time, she had allowed fear to define who she was. The decision came quietly, but firmly. The next morning, Laura sought out Antonio early. "I need to do something," she said bluntly. He looked at her attentively. "What?" "Tell the truth," she replied. "Not just to you, to whoever needs to hear it." Antonio didn't seem surprised. "That changes everything," he said. "I know," she replied, "but continuing to hide changes even more, and not for the better." They talked for a long time. Laura shared details she had never spoken out loud. She talked about manipulation, veiled threats, emotional isolation. She didn't dramatize, she didn't soften it. She simply told it as it was. Antonio listened with absolute attention. "He feeds on silence," Antonio said when she finished. "When you speak, he loses strength." "And if he reacts?" Laura asked. "He will," Antonio replied, "but this time it won't be just you against him." From that day on, Laura changed her posture. She no longer avoided certain places. She didn't hide when unfamiliar people appeared. She didn't lower her gaze, not because fear had disappeared, but because she had decided not to obey it anymore. The man noticed. The intimidation attempts changed tone. Indirect messages. Comments spread quietly. Hints dropped to the wrong people, but every attempt met resistance, not only from Antonio, but from an environment that was now alert. Laura felt the weight of it, but she also felt something new. Steadiness. One night, sitting on the main porch, she said, "I never thought staying would be harder than running." Antonio looked at her. "Staying takes courage," he said. "Running only takes survival." She nodded, feeling the weight of the truth. "I don't want to survive anymore," she said. "I want to live." Antonio remained silent for a few seconds. "Then you'll have to face everything you tried to forget," he said, "including who you were back then." Laura took a deep breath. "I'm ready." That same week, the final confrontation began to take shape, not with shouting or explicit threats, but through strategic moves, preventive reports, formal records, careful exposure of facts. The man began to lose ground, People stopped answering his calls. Doors closed. He tried direct contact one last time. Laura didn't respond. Antonio spoke for her. "It's over," he said firmly. "Here, you have no more power." The call ended without a reply. Laura felt her entire body tremble when she learned of it, not from fear, but from relief mixed with exhaustion. "I did it," she said, almost unable to believe it. "You faced it," Antonio corrected, "and that changes everything." That night, Laura slept deeply for the first time in years, not because the danger had completely disappeared, but because finally she had chosen not to run, and that choice no one could take from her anymore. The days that followed brought a strange feeling to Laura. It wasn't complete relief, nor absolute peace. It was something more subtle: stability. For the first time in a long while, she didn't wake up with her heart racing, anticipating invisible dangers. There was still caution, but no paralysis. There was still memory, but no longer control. The routine of the farm began to take on new meaning for her. It was no longer just a place to hide. It was a place to build. Each morning had purpose. Each task carried continuity. Laura began organizing the veterinary work with greater autonomy, proposing improvements in animal care, suggesting adjustments that Antonio listened to with genuine attention, not out of politeness, but out of growing trust. Antonio noticed this quiet change. He didn't comment on it directly, but he observed. He saw how Laura now walked with less tension in her shoulders, how she held eye contact when speaking with the workers, how her decisions no longer came wrapped in unspoken apologies. She was reclaiming space within her own life. One afternoon, as they reviewed a simple report together at the wooden kitchen table, Laura stopped mid-sentence. "Did you notice?" she asked. "What?" Antonio replied, without lifting his gaze. "I didn't think about him today," she said, surprised by herself. "Not even once." Antonio slowly raised his eyes. "That's freedom beginning," he said. "It doesn't arrive making noise." Laura smiled, her eyes slightly filling with tears. She didn't cry. She simply took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that realization. That night, they sat on the porch as they had been doing more often. It wasn't a planned ritual, it simply happened. The sky was clear, dotted with stars, and the silence of the farm carried a comforting tone. Laura held a mug of coffee gone cold, forgotten in her hands. "Antonio," she said after a long silence, "you never asked why I became a veterinarian." He looked at her attentively. "I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to." She nodded. "I became one because it was the only way to care without hurting," she said. "Animals don't manipulate. They don't control. They don't pretend affection." Antonio remained silent. "When I was trapped in that relationship," she continued, "I needed something to remind me who I was before the fear. Animals did that. They saved me without knowing it." "And now?" Antonio asked. "Now," she hesitated, "I think I'm learning to let someone take care of me too." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Antonio felt their weight, but didn't answer right away. He knew that kind of trust couldn't be rushed. "Caring doesn't mean controlling," he finally said. "It means respecting when someone wants to walk alone, and staying close when they can't." Laura nodded slowly. "That's what you've been doing," she said, "and I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Antonio replied. "Just stay while it makes sense." She turned to him. "And if one day it doesn't, then we accept it," he said, "but we don't live afraid of that day." Something settled inside Laura at that moment. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't dependence. It was a conscious choice. As the weeks passed, the presence of the man from her past gradually dissolved, not through forgetting, but through irrelevance. He made one last indirect move, a hollow threat, quickly neutralized. There was no more room for games. The control he had exercised for so long had broken. Laura received the final confirmation in a brief phone call. When she hung up, she stood still for a few seconds, staring at nothing. Antonio noticed. "It's over," she said softly. "For real." Antonio nodded. "Then now you begin," he replied. That night Laura slept deeply, without restless dreams, without sudden jolts awake. She slept like someone who finally felt safe inside her own body. In the days that followed, something new began to form between her and Antonio. There was no rush, no euphoria. It was intimacy built in silence, in small gestures, in conversations without scripts. Sometimes they walked the property together without saying a word. Other times they talked about simple things, the weather, the animals, old stories. One morning, Laura found Antonio in the workshop, restoring the old pickup truck. She watched him for a few minutes before speaking. "You're not someone who reveals himself easily," she said. "I never needed to," he replied, without stopping what he was doing. "And yet," she hesitated. "You let me see." Antonio set the tool down and looked at her. "Because you didn't try to use me," he said, "or hide behind appearances." Laura felt her heart race. "I'm still afraid," she admitted, "not of the past, but of the future." "Afraid of what?" Antonio asked. "Of losing this," she replied, gesturing to everything around them, and also to something invisible between them. Antonio stepped a little closer. "Nothing that's real is lost without leaving something better behind," he said. She took a deep breath, absorbing his words. In that moment, Laura realized something important. She was no longer there just to protect herself. She was there because she wanted to build something she had never had, a life without constant fear, without control, without running. And Antonio, in turn, realized that this woman was not merely someone in need of shelter. She was someone who brought transformation, someone who made him think about the future in a way he hadn't in years. Neither of them spoke about love, but both knew that something solid was slowly forming, at the right pace, and for the first time Laura didn't feel the urge to run. She felt the desire to stay. Time at Golden Valley Farm seemed to follow a different logic. It didn't rush, it didn't pressure, it didn't demand immediate decisions. Laura began to notice this in the small details, in the way the days repeated without becoming the same, in how each dawn brought the same landscape but never the same feeling. She no longer felt like a visitor, nor did she feel like a prisoner. It was something new, hard to name. Antonio watched this transformation with caution. Not because he doubted her, but because he understood the weight of deep change. He knew that when someone spends years surviving, learning how to live can be more frightening than any external threat. Laura now needed to learn to trust not only him, but the stability she was beginning to build within herself. One afternoon, as they walked toward a more distant pasture, Laura stopped suddenly. The wind blew strongly, swaying the tall vegetation, creating a continuous, almost hypnotic sound. "Antonio," she said, without turning around, "if you had never appeared, I would still be running." He stopped beside her. "Maybe," he replied, "or maybe you just needed time." "No," she said firmly. "I needed someone who didn't try to own me." Antonio felt the weight of that sentence. He knew well the kind of man who confused care with domination. He had seen it destroy families, businesses, entire lives. "I don't believe in possession," he said. "I believe in daily choice." Laura turned to him, surprised. "And do you choose me?" she asked, directly. The question carried no romantic tone. It carried truth. Antonio didn't answer immediately. He thought for a few seconds, as he always did when the answer mattered. "I choose those who walk beside me without needing to hide," he replied. "Today, that's you." Laura felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was responsibility. Choosing meant staying conscious. It meant not romanticizing. It meant facing reality. In the days that followed, a new challenge arose, not from the past, but from the present. Laura received a job offer, an invitation to take on an important position at a renowned clinic in another city. High salary, prestige, recognition. It was the kind of opportunity she would have accepted without hesitation before. She spent hours staring at the message, sitting in her room, feeling the conflict grow. It wasn't about running away. It was about choosing. That night, she told Antonio. He listened in silence, without interrupting, without showing immediate reaction. "It's a great opportunity," he said at last. "It is," she replied, "and that's what scares me." "Why?" Antonio asked. "Because for the first time I don't know if I want to go," she confessed. "Not out of fear, but because staying is also a choice now." Antonio nodded slowly. "Then you need to decide without thinking about me," he said. "If you stay because of someone, it becomes a prison." Laura took a deep breath. The answer stung a little, but she knew it was true. "And if I decide to stay?" she asked. "Then let it be, because you want this life," he replied. "Not because I exist in it." She remained silent for a long time after that. The next morning, Laura woke early and walked to the lake. She sat at the water's edge, watching the reflection of the clear sky. She thought about the past that had nearly destroyed her, about the present that was rebuilding her, about the future still uncertain. She realized something important. For the first time, her decision would not be driven by fear. When she returned to the house, Antonio was on the porch, reading calmly. She approached him. "I answered the offer," she said. He closed the book. "And what did you decide?" he asked without anxiety. "I turned it down," she replied. "Not because I'm afraid to leave, but because I want to see how far I can go by staying." Antonio watched her for a few seconds. There was no triumph in his gaze. There was respect. "Then you chose," he said. "I chose," she confirmed, "and if one day I decide to leave, I'll know it was by will, not by escape." Antonio nodded. "That's all that matters." In that moment, Laura felt something settle inside her. It wasn't emotional dependence, it was internal coherence. For the first time, her choices aligned with who she was becoming. That evening, they sat once again on the porch. The sky was heavy with clouds, announcing rain. Laura watched the horizon. "You didn't try to convince me to stay," she said. "Because I don't want someone beside me out of fear of loss," Antonio replied. "I want them by conscious choice." She smiled, deeply moved. "You're the first man who never tried to shape me," she said, "and that changed everything." The rain began to fall slowly, thick, steady. They stayed there side by side in silence. There was no urgency, no promises, just presence. Laura realized that this was the true final test. Not the threat of the past, not the fear of violence, but the ability to remain without erasing herself. And she was succeeding. Antonio, in turn, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't blind passion, it was solid hope. The sense that sharing life with someone didn't mean losing control, but expanding the horizon. When the rain stopped, Laura stood up. "Thank you for letting me choose," she said. Antonio answered only with a nod. He knew that choice made everything more real and stronger. Morning arrived quietly after the rain. The air was cooler, filled with that clean scent of washed earth that only exists after an intense night. Golden Valley Farm seemed to breathe at a different pace, as if everything had been rearranged during rest. Laura woke early, not from restlessness, but from habit. She opened the window and let the wind touch her face, feeling something rare, stability without rigidity. She walked toward the corral as the sun rose slowly. The animals were calm, and the workers had already begun the day's tasks. Laura moved among them naturally, exchanging few words, but carrying a steady presence. She didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need to explain herself. She was there because she had chosen to be. Antonio watched from a distance, leaning against the fence as he often did. He saw in her something that hadn't been there when she arrived. Wholeness. Not perfection, not absolute lightness. Wholeness. Someone who no longer lived, divided between running away and staying. When Laura approached, he spoke. "You seem different today." "I feel different," she replied. "Not like someone who won something, but like someone who stopped losing." Antonio nodded slowly. Sometimes that's the greatest victory. They walked together toward the main house. It wasn't an exaggerated symbolic gesture. It was simply continuity, life unfolding without the need to be constantly narrated. Laura knew the past never disappears completely. She knew certain memories would never cease to exist, but now they occupied the right place, behind her, not ahead. They no longer dictated her steps. That afternoon, Laura received one last message. Short, no direct threat, just a final attempt to exist. She read it, took a deep breath, and deleted it. She didn't respond. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. For the first time, she felt no need to prove anything to anyone. She showed it to Antonio only to share, not out of fear. "He doesn't have space anymore," she said. "Because you didn't give him any," Antonio replied. The sun began to sink slowly, painting the sky in warm tones. Laura sat on the porch, watching the fields transform in the fading light. She thought about everything she had lived through in the past months, the fear she had carried with her, the courage she didn't know she had, and the way life had found a strange but honest way to place her exactly where she needed to be. Antonio sat beside her, respecting the silence. "I never thought peace would feel like this," Laura said. "I always imagined it would come as euphoria, as absolute certainty." "Peace doesn't make noise," he replied. "It just stays." Laura smiled. "You never promised me anything," she said, "and even so, you gave me everything I needed." "Because what you needed," Antonio replied, "was space to be who you are." She looked at him carefully. There was no rush in his gaze, no unrealistic expectation, just mutual recognition. "I don't know what will happen from here on," Laura said. "Neither do I," Antonio replied. "But I know how I want to walk." "How?" she asked. "Without holding on," he said, "and without running away." Whim! Laura felt both the weight and the lightness of that sentence at the same time. That night, they stayed on the porch until the stars filled the sky completely. Neither of them spoke about love. They didn't need to. What existed there was more solid than hurried words. Laura realized her story had never been about escaping someone. It had been about finding herself. And Antonio hadn't been a savior. He had been someone who knew how to stay without demanding. When she stood to go inside, she stopped at the door and looked at him. "Antonio." "Yes?" "Thank you for not asking anything of me when I had nothing to give." He looked at her calmly. "You always had," he said. "You just needed to believe it." Laura went inside. Antonio stayed a while longer, watching the darkness over the fields. He knew that story didn't end there. He knew real relationships don't close with ready-made answers. They continue day after day in the quiet choice to remain. Golden Valley Farm remained the same to those who passed by on the road. Earth, fences, silence, hard work. But there, within that simple space, something had been rebuilt with patience and truth. Laura was no longer running. Antonio was no longer alone. And sometimes that is all a good story needs to truly begin.